All right, folks, this is the final week of our Advent in the Old Testament series. So far, we've been in the Garden of Eden. We've been building tents to worship in out in the wilderness outside of Egypt. And we've been in cyclical oppression and rebellion in the book of Judges. So we've covered a lot of ground. All three of those stories have a common thematic element. They have several, but there's one that I'll highlight. And it's a season of sojourning. If you're not familiar with the word sojourning, like to sojourney, to journey in such a way, one who wanders, one who is a nomad would be another good word for that. Adam and Eve are removed from their home in the Garden of Eden due to disobedience, and now they have to make a new home for themselves that's ultimately temporary now that death is introduced into the world. In Exodus, when we talked about the tabernacle, God commands the freshly liberated Israelites to make a pop-up tent and altar for themselves that's got sticks that you can carry on it because they need to be mobile. They are sojourning. And then in Judges, while they finally are in the Promised Land, they're more of an established nation, newly established nation. Enemy nations repeatedly come in to conquer them, making them strangers in their own home. So while they may not be, by the strictest definition, wandering anymore, they still have had the identity of home stripped away from them, and they are looking for solutions to that. We know we've been progressing through the Old Testament at this point. We're actually going to regress tonight and go back to Genesis to look at another sojourner, maybe the most famous one in the Old Testament, which would be Abraham. So I'll be starting in Genesis chapter 12, if you want to make your way there. We'll be covering quite a bit of ground within the book of Genesis. We'll be starting in Genesis chapter 12. So over the last 3 weeks, obviously, we've been focusing on the advent or the arrival of Jesus. And this week, we're going to be adding to the advent of Christ, the advent of Isaac, Abraham's promised son. We're going to be looking at a second advent here. There's this thing called, and I love this, there's this thing called the lullaby effect, which is when you have especially grown up hearing certain stories or tropes or that sort of thing over and over again, it kind of fades into the background and can kind of, at least metaphorically, sometimes literally, put you to sleep. I think a lot of these Old Testament stories, especially in things like in Genesis that you grew up hearing in Sunday school if you went to church, or that have made their way into popular culture, those sorts of things, they can really suffer from the lullaby effect. I don't want you to go into these stories today with this being background noise. I want you to put this back in the forefront of your mind's ear, that we will be hearing it with a freshness and with an appropriate amount of our preconceptions checked at the door, that we're coming into it with a freshness here. So as we're hearing about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, take these things over again. So let's go ahead and jump in here to Genesis 12. We'll start in just the first 3 verses of the chapter. And this is the first interaction that we have recorded between God and Abraham. In this story, Abram, his name changes later on in the relationship, but you're not missing much context in Abraham and God's relationship. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Okay, so to put a little bit of context on who, I'm just going to call them Abraham and Sarah, regardless of what point in the story we're in. You'll just have to humor me there. There's no way I can get the names right in each section here. Abraham and Sarah have been walking through infertility for likely 50 plus years at this point, because they're 75 at the time of when God comes to talk to them. That is shown to us a couple verses after this when they get ready to become nomads. So Abraham's predecessors, I mean, were having kids in their 30s. Even at this point in human history, where people are living to be 200 years old plus, they were still, a lot of them starting their families at the age of 30. And so 75, you're talking working up towards 50 years of struggling with infertility. They had so closed the door on having biological children, at least had kind of grieved through that and processed through that, that they had essentially adopted their nephew Lot, who now lived with them and was traveling with them and basically looked at as their surrogate son. Later in the story, you hear about their servant who kind of managed their household, Eliezer of Damascus, who had kind of taken on another son role in the house. That Abraham at one point, he's like, God, you haven't given me any children still. Eliezer is going to inherit everything that I have. He's not even my own flesh and blood. And so you can see those are, classic signs of this time of saying, hey, we've worked through this. We've shut the door on ever having kids. And in this time and culture in particular, infertility was a massive point of shame because so much was tied to the honor in your family and carrying on a family name and a legacy and all those things, even more than what we have today. So, question for all of us, what are some of the emotions that you think Abraham and Sarah are feeling as God speaks to them and says, hey, a nation is about to come through you? What do you guys think are some of the emotions that they're processing after walking through infertility for 50 years and now being told, hey, we're going to start a nation from your family line?
What took so long?
Yeah.
Probably excitement and also some unbelief.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, we're excited, but no way.
I was gonna say doubt. I feel like you're like, okay, but like, what's the catch?
Right.
Maybe what I'm thinking, or
Like, is that just me?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is it a God way of saying things that I don't understand?
Yeah.
Is it gonna happen that way?
Right. Absolutely. I think like Donna kind of alluded to, there might be a bitterness in that, like what she was saying, what took you so long? It's like,
Can you? Because this is at the very beginning.
mhm.
It's going to make them wait 25 more years.
Yeah.
Really, you liar? I mean,
Yeah.
seriously,
That's
what they.
that's exactly right.
You told me this, but and I've always questioned why did he tell them and then wait? What was that growing process? Why?
Yeah.
So long.
Yeah. Let's dig into it today because that's exactly right. This is a 25-year Advent. So remember, Advent meaning to come to, to arrive at. So this is the advent of Isaac, the advent of a nation, the advent of a promise here that they have to go through 25 years of waiting. And I will tell you, as one half of a couple who deals with a life-altering and at least apparently permanent physical condition in my wife being legally blind, if a doctor walks into the room and says, hey, I think I can cure your wife's blindness, my reaction is very not joyful. My reaction is, you better shut your mouth before I shut it for you. Because we've already grieved through that. We've already adjusted our lives to that, and we've said, we've come to terms with it. If a doctor comes in selling this bill of goods, my first response, whether right or not, is do not get our hopes back up. Because that wound, it hurts. And to open that back up, it's excruciating. And it's the same type of thing, maybe even more so given the culture and the much longer time span and all that they're like, God, don't bring this back up. Isn't it bad enough that we've been trying to have a kid for over 40 years and we're past the age of when people are having kids now, and you're going to tell us now? Like, don't do that to us. Many, if not all of you guys understand that, when you go through a grieving process, whether that's for the loss of a loved one or the loss of health or a life that you once had or whatever type of grief that is, when you finally have processed it and come to this place of acceptance and a new normal, it's not a process you're interested in going through twice. You said, I've gone through it once and I'd like to just leave that in the rear view. I don't want to re-walk that road. So that is what God is putting Abraham and Sarah through when he seemingly out of the blue, at least in the way that it's written, comes to them when they're 75 saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. So I know it's easy, again, lullaby effect. It's easy to read this and be like, hey, it's all good news. It's all happy. It's all, all this stuff. And I do think that there's probably an element of that in there, but that is not what I see. And I don't think what we're going to see as we go through the rest of the story. I think the prevailing narrative is doubt and bitterness through 25 years of walking with God. So let's look at the progression of this promise that God makes. So, sorry, I'm going to try to zoom this out so you guys can see it all. Okay. So you can see where we started, which was in the verse that we just read. This is from 12:2. After 50 plus years or 40 plus years of infertility, I'll make you a great nation. Promise from God. There's a lot of other promises in there, but we'll focus in on that one. Now, after their adopted son Lot leaves, there's a dispute that happens between the shepherds that work under Abraham and the shepherds that work under Lot. There's kind of infighting. And so Abraham takes him up on a big mountain. He says, all right, Lot, left or right? And so it gives him his choice. Lot goes over towards Sodom and Gomorrah. We talked last week about how that works out. And Abraham takes what's left. So right after Lot, who, again, Abraham and Sarah had adopted essentially, not legally, but had taken on as their son and probably were thinking, all right, if God's making a nation out of us, Lot's still family, It could come through his bloodline. It still counts. It's still part of, I know he's not my offspring. We've taken him into our house. Like, that still works. Lot has now left, and immediately, the next verse, after he has walked off towards Sodom and Gomorrah, God comes and says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. Not Lot's offspring, not your brother Haran's son. We're not going through that. It's your offspring. So he brings some further clarity. It's your offspring who's going to be numerous. Now, this is after, the third one here, after Abraham starts saying, look, God, you still haven't brought any kids in here. We're several years into the project at this point. Nothing's happening. Eliezer, my servant, is going to be my heir. God says this man, meaning Eliezer, will not be your heir. Your very own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look towards heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. God ups the ante even more. He says, no, your own son. Not even a daughter, which at this point would have meant that the family lineage traveled through men in this culture, not through women. So he's saying, you're not just going to have a child, you're going to have a son that carries on your name and your legacy going forward from here. And it's going to be numerous. Then after they had given up on trying to have a child through Sarah, and Sarah says, hey, take my handmaid Hagar, and it can still come through you, Abraham. It's still your family line. God's promised you that you're going to have a son. Let's try surrogacy through Hagar. After they give it up and do that, God ups the ante again in chapter 17 by saying, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. And guess what? I've already got a name for him, and it's not Ishmael like you named the other kid. His name shall be Isaac. So again, he continues to turn it up a degree. Now, after Abraham begs God to just take Ishmael, he said, please, God, just use Ishmael to do the promise. I can't take it anymore. He says, I will establish my covenant, not with Ishmael, but with Isaac. I'll take care of Ishmael, but my covenant goes with Isaac, whom Sarah, again, your wife Sarah, we're building on the blocks here, whom your wife Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. Again, adding another layer. It started by just saying, there's going to be a nation that comes through you and your family's going to be a blessing. Okay, no, there's going to be a nation that comes through you, Abraham. Oh, no, there's going to be a nation that comes through you and Sarah, Abraham. Oh, no, there's going to be a nation that comes through you and Sarah. It's just going to come through your son named Isaac. I'm going to have a covenant with. Oh, and by the way, it's going to be a nation that comes through you and your wife, and you're going to have a son, and his name's going to be Isaac, and you're going to be numerous. And guess what? It's going to be in a year from today. All of these things, he just keeps building and building and building on this promise. And at the end Sarah still can't take it. She's been laughing to hide the tears. Abraham and Sarah wake up every single day to an unmet promise for 25 years. No matter how many times God ups the ante and says all these things, can you imagine the knife in your side every morning when you wake up and realize today's not the day? That would not increase my faith, that would decrease my faith. Speaking for me personally, it'd be excruciating to go through. So the advent of Isaac spans 25 years. We can see in the last verse here, if I can pull this off, it's always really risky to try and get the box to go away. Okay, good. After 25 years of waiting, hoping, hurting, doubting, and finally believing, it was counted to Abraham as righteousness when he believed that God's covenant was good, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. You can see each one of those things, apart from the multitude and the nation, fulfilled in this 3-verse chunk. 25 years. And finally, what used to be bitterness in Abraham's voice when he says, "Behold, you've given me no offspring," in chapter 15, verse 3. Or when he says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you," in 17:18. Or when Sarah says, "What, now that I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have this pleasure of becoming a mother?" in chapter 18, verse 12. After all of that, basically begging God, no more promises, no more broken hearts. Please don't do this to us again, God, any other way. 25 years, finally get the advent of Isaac. It's a bitter road. I'm sure there was a lot of times where God would say something and they wish that he would stop, because it feels like God hasn't made good on his promises.
Well, I think there's probably a little adaptation of normal physiology going on to that.
Maybe just a touch. It even says right before the verse I just quoted about when Sarah calls herself worn out and old and all that, right before that it says the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah for some time now. You know, it doesn't take a lot of reading between the lines to say she's postmenopausal. You know, like this is a biological impossibility, as they say.
100, that's probably pretty normal.
I would imagine that's probably true. That's more than fair. And so the bottom line is,
25 plus 75?
That's him, but she's 10,
Oh,
about 10 years
okay.
younger.
Okay.
but it is still quite old. Like we are to the point where child rearing is well off of your typical timetable. Not always for the men, but especially for the women at this point. The way of women was no longer with her. It's nothing short of a miracle, like you said, Dan. The emotional swing that must have happened in this house would have been staggering, that as bitterness mounts over 25 years, the joy that comes in the pregnancy and finally the delivery, the joy would have eclipsed that for them. And you can see that in the name that God picks, Isaac, meaning laughter. You know, that the whole time he's like, hey, look, you're going to love it. It's going to be worth it. Watch this. God has made good on his promise here to them. There's obvious parallels here, and we're about to go look at them, between the advent of Isaac and the advent of Jesus. But before we do, I wanted to just offer you guys a little bit of time to process, discuss, ask questions, that sort of thing. We'll just discuss openly as a room here before we move into our next section. Thoughts so far?
thought I had was, you know how Abraham was struggling with doubt, and like I think how I would have probably responded, like even after the joy of Isaac being born, I'd be like, "Oh God, great, awesome, thank you," and then I'd be like, "What if he dies? What if something bad happens to him when he's like as a little kid? Like I'd be like protecting him at all costs.
Yeah.
Like you can't go out there because something might happen to you, and my promise might go away.
Yeah.
I wonder if he ever had those types of thoughts, like it just just fear.
So I would suspect if he did, it was not the prevailing narrative because of what happens next. In the story, the very next thing that happens, and there's obviously time that passes in between the birth of Isaac and the almost sacrifice of Isaac, but that is the next scene that we have in Scripture, is God telling Abraham, all right, today's the day. Time for you to kill your son, go take him up to the mountain, offer him as a sacrifice to me. And so I mentioned earlier, why would God have put them through 25 years of what I would call nothing short of torture? It feels like psychological, emotional torture at this point. But I think what that develops, all roads seem to lead back to James, but that trial produced endurance in them, steadfastness in them. And you see it borne out in when God tells him to go sacrifice Isaac, he goes. In fact, in Hebrews 11, what it talks about is, this is in the Hall of Faith passage talking about Abraham, that he goes and he takes his son up on the mountain, and that Hebrews gives us insight into what Abraham's thinking and feeling in that moment. He says, and Abraham goes up there knowing that this is the child of the promise and is willing to sacrifice him, knowing that his God will raise him from the dead if necessary. Because what that communicates is a deep surety in that this God keeps his promises. Because I watched for 25 years God make the same promise consistently that a nation was coming through Isaac. And there ain't no nation yet, which means God's not done yet. And so he's able to say, yes, God, he's yours. I shouldn't have had him. I will go do this and trust you with the process. And we see what God does with that, obviously. So if there was the fear and the protectiveness and all that, it was erased when he went to go make the sacrifice.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of myself as well. It's like man, that'd be hard, like not trusting him. But then I can also see like Abraham saying like the miracle that he's even born is like, okay, God, you can do it.
Well, I think the biggest difference between us and between Abraham is 25 years of walking through a promise with God and having that realized in that way. I mean, that impacts your type of faith, because I'd be right there with you. I'd be like desperately trying to hold the glass house together, keep the pieces from shattering. Be like, no, we're going to preserve this promise, but it's because we haven't walked the journey that got you to the point of developing the endurance to take the big step. So,
And I was reading something, and it was talking about the other people at that time, the other, we'll say, gods,
yeah.
okay? That was the way they were worshipped. You killed your children, you gave them your children. So like, he would not just have, you're wanting the son of promise.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a minute, you weren't like this before.
Right.
What happened?
Yeah, I mean, there would have been an identity crisis in there of like, man, I've been in a really intimate relationship with God for 25 years with this promise, but I've been part of a God-worshiping family for my whole life, is the way that it's portrayed in the genealogies and whatnot. You're like, who is this God of my fathers who would make promises, who would tear me down for 25 years, give me immense joy just to crush me by sacrificing to him? Is this a God I even want to serve? It's like, man, it was a huge ask. It doesn't get much bigger than that, except for the biggest ask, which was when Jesus did the same thing. It was that the parallels. I had a whole section written on this. I took it out because this isn't an Easter message, but it was the parallels between Isaac going up with Abraham onto the mountain and God sending his son and Jesus going to the cross. I mean, it's crazy, right down to the fact that Isaac had to carry the wood for the sacrifice. He goes up there, he doesn't even know that he's the sacrifice, but he's going up there carrying the wood just like Jesus carried the cross. Like it's just really powerful imagery that you see. Like Brian was saying earlier, you could almost look at the entire Old Testament as prophecy pointing to Jesus. That scene's no exception. Anything else? Okay, well then we go from the advent of Isaac and the progression of a promise over to the pain of a promise. This is the advent of Jesus. The many promises about a Messiah coming to Israel probably stung just like those promises about Isaac to Sarah and Abraham. Think back to a story we should be pretty familiar with by this point, but Adam and Eve, right? So when Adam and Eve's seed crushes their other seed, when Cain kills Abel, the words from God where he said that your offspring will crush the head of the serpent probably felt like it was ringing pretty empty at that point. Or when Israel divides into two kingdoms, they've been conquered by Assyria and Babylon, I'm sure that this promise to David in 2 Samuel felt pretty empty. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up from your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. I shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. David has a son who takes the throne. His name is Solomon. And at some point, Solomon dies. When Solomon dies, you must be sitting here thinking, my gosh, what did this promise even mean? God just let the offspring of David, who's supposed to reign in the kingdom forever, die. And then worse than that, when you're like, okay, so we're talking later on, right? We're going to talk later on, there's going to be a kingdom established. Then the kingdom gets eviscerated, splits in two after Solomon's son takes over. Enemy nation comes in and conquers. Nation scattered. Like, what kingdom that's going to reign forever? The bitterness towards God. Or when it says in Isaiah 11:10, in that day the root of Jesse, which is the Messiah, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place will be glorious. Talking about how this Messiah is going to gather the nations together, and that they're going to increase the people of God and increase the nation of Israel. And I'm sure that that was painful when the nations came to dominate Israel. Like, this is not the gathering we had in mind, God. Undo. And then in Isaiah 7:14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, this should be very common at this time of the year. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. We've talked about that means God with us. But God probably didn't feel, or the people of Israel probably didn't feel like God was very with them when he stopped talking to them for 400 years. Until John the Baptist showed up. And then in Isaiah 61:1, Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to the opening of the prison to those who are bound. And can you imagine if you're a prisoner in a Babylonian prison as an Israelite? Or can you imagine if you are born blind, or if you've gone through immense grief and loss, and you're brokenhearted, that you're a captive, that you're a slave, that you're a prisoner, which most of Israel was. And you hear Isaiah give this prophecy, and you're like, stop making promises. Look what's happened. And we know, being able to read the scripture, that Israel brought a lot of this destruction on themselves. But at some point you read this and you're like, God, stop it. I don't want the promises. Leave me alone. Just like Abraham and Sarah. But then, when the long-awaited arrival of this child finally comes to pass, you get a scene like this one from Luke 2. I'll scroll through this one. Luke 2:25 through 38. This is after Jesus' birth. They take him to the temple for the first time. Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ, the Messiah. Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's a title. And he came in the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms, and he blessed God, saying, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. And his father and his mother marveled at what was said about him. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed, and a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed. And then on top of that, we have in 36, and there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. She did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. This is the joyful response of two, I guess you could look at them as parental figures of Israel at this point in the temple of Jerusalem. The old people are hanging out and talking about Jesus coming and talking about Messiah and all this stuff. And all of a sudden he comes. You've got old man Simeon holding up a baby, just proclaiming to anyone who will listen. You've got Anna over here in the corner saying, guys, it's now. It's now. The joy is immense. You can think to another really common scene, also from the book of Luke, of when the angels appear to the shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth, that they are singing and that they're proclaiming, peace on earth, joy to the world. All these hymns that we sing tied to this moment, that's what a response of the Advent is supposed to be, is this joyfulness that comes out of a growth of bitterness, comes out of desperation, that comes out of hurt and pain and suffering, brokenness, darkness, like Luke was talking about. That now this marvelous light, not to quote Charlie Hall, but that this marvelous light would come and would illuminate a dark and bitter heart and restore a nation and individuals' hearts to himself. The similarity between the two Advents are, they're pretty clear. As you can see, the similarities of the promises made throughout history and the people who had to bear the weight of those and who maybe never even got to see the fullness of the promise come to pass. But then the arrival being so powerful. Yet even after the child arrives, there's still promises that are unmet. While God may be with us, look at it for, I don't want to get out ahead of my skis here. So while God may be with us, Emmanuel, he has not yet set them free. They're still captives, not just to Roman Empire, but to their own sin. And while the seed of Eve and of David is now born, the serpent hasn't been crushed, and Jesus has yet to establish his eternal kingdom when the infant is born. So the Advent was the fulfillment of some promises, but not of all the promises. Before, during, and after the birth of their son, Abraham and Sarah continued to sojourn. They were still nomads. They were shepherds and herds people, and they would pick up their tents and they'd move all throughout the land of Canaan, which is the promised land. God told them basically, just walk laps through this country that I'm going to give to your offspring one day. And the most anticipated part of the promise, the arrival of Isaac, their son, that part's come to pass. And it's been given to them, but there's still a lot else that hasn't been done. The land has been promised to them, but it hasn't been given to them yet. A nation from this family to fill the land has been promised, but right now there's just a family of 3. and a blessing to the entire world was promised all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, that all of the nations would be blessed through you. It's been promised, but not given. Oh, sorry, guys. I alluded to part of this passage, what comes after this section, earlier, but Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, when he was told to go to the land of Canaan. And he went out not knowing where he was going, and by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. She considered that God was faithful. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, she thinks, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore, the two things that God had promised. These all died in faith, talking about Isaac, Abraham, Jacob, Sarah, the other people in the hall of faith that talks about in this passage, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Abraham lived in tents, looking over a promised land, looking forward to the city that God was going to build. Seeing all this land, he's like, hey, all this is going to be ours. I'm looking at an empty field right now. I'm looking at Jericho, or I'm looking at, whatever. He said, one day God's going to build a city that doesn't have tent poles. It's going to have foundations. And he had to acknowledge that he was a stranger. But I love the way that the writer of Hebrews says this. He's a stranger not just in the land of Canaan. He says, I'm a stranger on earth. There's nowhere, even if this land was mine tomorrow, it still wouldn't be home. Because he longs for something more. Abraham could have returned to the land of Ur, the Chaldeans, where he came from, at any moment. He said, pack it up, we're going home. We're tired of the tent life. We're going home. But that's not home for him either. Just like Canaan's not home, Ur's not home. The only home is a heavenly country. It's always been about closeness to God. It's never been about the plot of land, the dirt under the feet, the grass, the cities, whatever. When God made this promise to Abraham, the faith they developed in him, it's always been about closeness to God. Every single human being on earth is just like Abraham. We're all seeking a homeland. People who struggle with depression and suicide, they often mention this feeling that there's just no place for them here. I just don't belong. I just don't fit in with this family or with this society or culture or whatever. They feel isolation and alone. People with gender dysphoria who, would maybe later go through transgender surgery or whatever, they would express that they don't feel like they belong in their body. Not just in society or in a city or state. They can't move anywhere because I don't feel good in my own skin. I don't belong here. Kids who've been passed from home to home and school to school, foster care, adoption, group homes, all this stuff. They feel like there is no home for them. They want nothing more than a homeland. And for the immigrant, they often can't go home. And this doesn't yet feel like home where they are right now. The brokenness that we feel in life is a reminder that we, like Abraham, are seeking a homeland that cannot be found in a particular country or in a particular identity or in a particular life that we lead. We are hardwired to seek out a heavenly country. I know I've mentioned this before, but in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, we've been listening to the audiobooks with Jasper. It's been amazing. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's this character. He shows up first in Prince Caspian, but it's Reepicheep the mouse. And it's this mouse that's like the size of a house cat. And he's dressed like a Three Musketeers, not the candy bar, but the other one. And he is the picture of nobility and chivalry and honor and all of these things. And he's all about seeking adventure and all of this stuff. And he confides in some of these children, the human children that are on the voyage, that when he was just like a little baby mouse, that there was, I think it was a fairy or something, had come to him and would sing this song to him that basically was almost like a little riddle and a promise that would say, the essence of it was, hey, Reepicheep, one day you're going to go find Aslan's country, and you're going to go live in Aslan's country. When you find where the water is supposed to be salty, but it's actually fresh, you say sweet, then keep swimming east, and there you'll find Aslan's country. And so this whole voyage kind of has this, there's a bunch of ups and downs through the whole story, but Reepicheep's in this the whole time. And then there's this one point where Reepicheep, it's near the end of the book, he gets knocked off the boat, and he's kind of sputtering out in the ocean for a second, and then he just starts laughing. And he's almost hysteric with his laughter. And everyone's like, get Reepicheep back on board. This mouse is about to die. And he's just squeaking, saying, it's sweet, it's sweet. Saying that the water that he's in, it's not salty, it's fresh water, it's sweet water. And he just starts going off the edge of the world. They throw in his little boat for him that he uses, hops in it, and he just goes off east into the sunset, over the edge of Narnia, into Aslan's country. His whole life, he had lived for honor and for adventure and all of this stuff. And yet, despite how great he was as a swordsman, as great as he was as a friend, and all of those things, he's one of the best characters in Narnia. He always desired a heavenly homeland. Aslan's country, the perfect country, where there's no pain, there's no suffering. You get to be close with Aslan, who's the Jesus character. I think this passage is what C.S. Lewis is pulling from as he writes that Narnia passage. We, like Reepicheep, are hardwired to seek a heavenly country. And the church, meaning the people, us, the ones indwelt by the Holy Spirit, we are heavenly embassies for the heavenly homeland. So we're little plots of heaven land here in a country of brokenness. Just like if you went over to England, there would be a little embassy that's got an American flag waving over the top, and that's American soil somehow. Same thing with us. We act as embassies on earth when we gather together like this for worship. That plot of land is a little bit bigger for a season, then we go back out and we take that with us. Here at Magnify, one of our the desires that God's given us as a church is to be a church for the nuns and for the duns. People have no religious background. The people who used to be in church and said, hey, I'm done with that, I'm out. Those who are wandering the world seeking a homeland. Because they felt like they couldn't find it, the church. They went to go find a homeland somewhere else. When they interact with you, or when they come to a worship gathering, or you are inviting them into the embassy of heaven. That's what this is. When you have interactions with nuns and nuns, you invite them into the embassy of heaven, and they can stay as long as they like. And they can become ambassadors. And they can join us as we wait, like Abraham, looking over a world promised to us, envisioning the foundations of the kingdom which God builds. It's like Abraham looked in the land of Canaan and said, There's no Jerusalem there, but one day there's going to be a Jerusalem right there, and God's going to build it. We have seen the child born. We've seen the promises made about what the full impact of that child will be on all of creation. And we look and we say, hey, one day, kingdom of God's going to be right there. It's a little bit here now. It's going to be more there later. There's one final advent. It's the final advent of Jesus when he comes back the second time. John 14, 1-3, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, when I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. That's where I am. That where I am, you may be also. That's the final advent. And that's the final thing I'm going to say.